Most football fans think the biggest threat to World Cup 2026 is security, or transportation, or even immigration. But economists are watching something entirely different: oil. Because thousands of miles away from the stadiums of America, a crisis involving Iran could end up costing World Cup 2026 billions of dollars. And if the situation gets worse, the biggest sporting event on earth could become one of the most expensive World Cups in history. America didn't host World Cup 2026 just for football. America hosted it for money, lots of money. For years, politicians, business leaders, and tourism officials have talked about the economic opportunity surrounding the tournament. Millions of visitors, billions in spending, hotels packed, flights full, restaurants overflowing. The logic was simple. People from every corner of the world would travel to the United States, and every visitor would bring money. The World Cup was supposed to become one of the largest tourism events in modern American history. The tournament expanded to 48 teams and 104 matches, making it the biggest World Cup ever organized. But there was one assumption behind all those projections: travel needed to remain affordable. And that's where the Iran story begins. Most football fans don't spend much time thinking about the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, most people have never heard of it. Yet this narrow stretch of water may have more influence over World Cup 2026 than almost any stadium in America, because a significant portion of the world's oil supply normally moves through that region. When tensions involving Iran escalate, global energy markets react immediately. Oil prices rise, shipping costs increase, airlines face higher fuel expenses, and suddenly a conflict thousands of miles away begins affecting consumers around the world. Most people see geopolitics. Economists see costs. To understand the danger, you need to understand how airlines operate. Airlines make money on thin margins. Fuel is one of their largest expenses. When fuel prices rise, airlines have only a few options. They can absorb the cost, they can reduce routes, or they can pass the cost to passengers. And that's exactly what often happens. Higher fuel prices lead to higher ticket prices. Now imagine what that means for World Cup fans: a family flying from Europe, a supporter traveling from South America, a group of friends coming from Asia. Every increase in airfare raises the total cost of attending the tournament, and that matters more than most people realize. People assume World Cup tickets are the expensive part. Often they aren't. Flights, hotels, food, transportation. Those costs frequently exceed the ticket itself. Now imagine all of those expenses increasing at the same time. Higher fuel costs increase airfare. Higher energy costs push up hotel expenses. Inflation affects restaurants. Transportation becomes more expensive. The trip that once cost $4,000 now costs $5,000. The trip that cost $5,000 now costs $6,000. Suddenly, attending the World Cup becomes a luxury many fans can no longer justify. And that's where economists start getting nervous, because tourism is extremely sensitive to price. The World Cup economy depends on visitors, not viewers. Visitors, this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. The World Cup doesn't need to fail. Stadiums can still be full. Television ratings can still be enormous. The tournament can still be remembered as a sporting success, yet economically the story could be very different, because economic projections are built on assumptions. Millions of visitors, millions of hotel bookings, millions of restaurant visits, millions of airline tickets. What happens if those numbers are lower? Not 50% lower, just 5% lower, or 10%. That could mean hundreds of millions of dollars in lost spending. And unlike football matches, there is no trophy for economic expectations. Reality either delivers or it doesn't. The irony is remarkable. FIFA spent years preparing for stadium operations, security planning, transportation logistics, broadcast infrastructure. But some of the biggest threats to the tournament are emerging far outside football: Iran, oil, shipping routes, energy markets, global inflation. These are not football stories, yet they could shape the World Cup experience for millions of people. The world has become more connected than ever before, which means a crisis on one side of the planet can influence a sporting event on the other. And the story doesn't end with oil, because geopolitical uncertainty affects far more than fuel prices. When investors become nervous, markets become volatile. When markets become volatile, businesses become cautious. And when businesses become cautious, economic growth slows. That's important because the World Cup isn't taking place in a vacuum. It's taking place during a period when governments around the world are already facing debt problems, inflation concerns, and slowing growth. The United States is carrying enormous levels of debt. Europe faces economic uncertainty. China is dealing with its own challenges. The global economy is already under pressure. The last thing policymakers want is another geopolitical shock. Now imagine you're a football fan planning a trip a year in advance. You're not just looking at ticket prices, you're looking at exchange rates, airline costs, hotel rates, the overall economy. If uncertainty keeps growing, some people delay spending, others cancel plans entirely. That's how economic slowdowns begin, not with one massive event, but with millions of small decisions made by ordinary people. One family decides not to travel. One group of friends postpones their trip. One tourist chooses a cheaper destination. Individually, those decisions don't matter. Collectively, they matter a lot. This is why economists pay attention to confidence. Confidence influences spending. Spending drives economies. And confidence is surprisingly fragile. People often assume economic growth depends on factories, technology, or government policies. Those things matter. But confidence matters too. If consumers feel optimistic, they spend money. If businesses feel optimistic, they invest money. If travelers feel optimistic, they book trips. Confidence keeps economic activity moving, and geopolitical crises have a habit of damaging confidence. The World Cup was supposed to be one of the biggest tourism events in American history. Cities across the country spent years preparing for an influx of visitors. Hotels expanded capacity. Restaurants hired workers. Airlines increased routes. Local governments invested money. Everyone was preparing for a boom. But those expectations depend on one critical assumption. People have to show up. Every forecast, every projection, every economic promise ultimately depends on visitors arriving and spending money. That's why even small changes matter. Imagine visitor numbers fall by 5%. At first glance, that doesn't sound dramatic. But across millions of expected visitors, 5% becomes a huge number. That's thousands of hotel rooms sitting empty, thousands of flights that aren't booked, thousands of restaurant tables that never fill, millions of dollars that never enter local economies. The stadiums can still be packed, the matches can still be exciting, yet the economic impact can still disappoint. And that's one of the biggest misconceptions surrounding major sporting events. People often assume economic activity and economic benefit are the same thing. They aren't. A city can host a successful event while generating less economic value than expected. A tournament can produce incredible television ratings while falling short of financial projections. That's why economists often approach major events with skepticism. Not because they dislike sports, but because they understand how difficult it is to predict human behavior. History is filled with examples. Before major sporting events, optimistic forecasts dominate the headlines. Politicians promise growth. Businesses anticipate profits. Tourism boards celebrate future demand. Then reality arrives. Sometimes expectations are exceeded, sometimes they're missed. Usually the outcome lands somewhere in the middle. The World Cup is unlikely to be different. There will be winners. Hotels will benefit, airlines will benefit, restaurants will benefit, but the size of those benefits remains uncertain. Now let's be clear. Nobody knows exactly what happens next. Oil markets are notoriously difficult to predict. Tensions can escalate, they can also ease. Shipping routes can become disrupted. They can also normalize. Energy prices can surge, they can also fall. That's what makes the situation so important. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the problem. Businesses hate uncertainty. Investors hate uncertainty. Travelers hate uncertainty. Even when the worst-case scenario never happens, uncertainty alone can influence behavior. And that brings us back to the World Cup, because beneath the football lies a much larger story. A story about globalization, a story about energy, a story about economics, and a story about how interconnected the modern world has become. The average football fan probably doesn't think about oil tankers when watching a match. They don't think about shipping routes. They don't think about geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. Yet those factors can influence the cost of attending the tournament, the profitability of airlines, the performance of local businesses, and ultimately the economic success of the entire event. When fans look back on World Cup 2026, they'll remember the goals, the upsets, the celebrations, the champions. But economists may remember something very different. They may remember the tournament that collided with one of the biggest geopolitical and energy disruptions of the decade, because the biggest threat to World Cup 2026 might not be on the field. It might not be immigration, it might not be security, it might not even be football. It might be a narrow stretch of water near Iran that most fans have never heard of. A place where oil, politics, and global economics intersect. And if the crisis continues, World Cup 2026 may prove something economists have understood for decades. In a global economy, nothing happens in isolation. Not even the biggest football tournament on earth.